Her late husband left a dry well on barren land. When she climbed down at 68, she never came back. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret stared at the yellow paper taped to her apartment door until the words stopped making sense. Past due. Final warning. Vacate within 14 days. At 68 years old, she stood in a hallway that smelled like bleach and old carpet, holding 2 grocery bags and wondering how her life had collapsed into a single sheet of paper. 3 years earlier, she had buried her husband, Daniel. 2 years earlier, the factory where she worked part-time had closed. Her savings disappeared slowly, then all at once. The calls from her children became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. Now the apartment was going too. That night, she sat alone at her kitchen table. Rain tapped softly against a window. The refrigerator hummed. And for the first time in her life, Margaret admitted something she had been refusing to say aloud. She had no idea what came next. 3 days later, a lawyer called. He informed her that Daniel had left her one final property, a piece of land she had never heard of. 40 acres, no house, no buildings, just barren ground outside a forgotten farming town called Red Creek, and one abandoned well. The lawyer apologized before hanging up. Apparently, everyone considered the land worthless. Margaret almost laughed. Of course he had left her the one thing nobody wanted. But 2 weeks later, with nowhere else to go, she packed her remaining belongings into an aging pickup truck and drove toward Red Creek. She had no idea that the dry well waiting there would change everything, or that before summer ended, nobody would ever see her as the same woman again. The road to Red Creek seemed to lead backward through time. Weathered barns leaned toward empty fields. Rusting tractors sat frozen beside collapsed fences. The town itself looked exhausted. The grocery store had boarded windows. Half the storefront were empty. Even the church bell tower carried cracks. Margaret found the property at sunset. The land stretched brown and silent beneath a fading orange sky. Nothing grew there except stubborn weeds. At the center stood an ancient stone well surrounded by wild grass. The rocks were dark with age. The wooden cover sagged. Everything about it felt abandoned, forgotten, just like her. She parked the truck and sat motionless. The wind whispered across the field. For a moment, she imagined Daniel standing beside her. She felt anger rising. After 43 years of marriage, this was what he left behind? A dead piece of land? A useless well? She spent her first week sleeping inside the truck. Each morning, she woke stiff and sore. Each night, she stared at the stars and questioned every decision that had brought her here. Then something strange happened. An elderly man stopped his truck beside the property fence. He stared at the well for several seconds. Then he removed his hat, not to Margaret, to the well, before driving away. The next day, a woman did the same thing, and the day after that, another. People kept stopping, looking, remembering something, then leaving. Nobody explained why. By the end of the week, Margaret's curiosity outweighed her exhaustion. Who were these people, and why did they all seem connected to a dry well in the middle of nowhere? The answer began with a metal box. It happened after a storm. Heavy rain washed away part of the soil near the well. Margaret noticed something sticking from the earth, a rusted corner. She dug it out. Inside the box, she found dozens of envelopes wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Every envelope carried a different name. No return address, no explanation, only names. Some dated back 30 years, others 40. The handwriting belonged to Daniel. Margaret froze. Her husband had never mentioned any of this, not once. That evening, she opened the oldest envelope. Inside was a letter. A young woman thanked Daniel for helping her stay in school after her father died. The next letter came from a man who credited Daniel with helping him find work after prison. The third letter thanked him for paying hospital bills. The fourth described a family saved from foreclosure. The fifth thanked him for simply listening when nobody else would. Margaret read until dawn. Each letter raised a bigger question. Why had Daniel hidden them? And how could a man who spent most evenings quietly reading in a recliner have touched so many lives? The next morning, she went into town. Her first stop was the diner. When she mentioned Daniel's name, the waitress stopped pouring coffee. "You were married to him?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded. The waitress stared at her for several seconds. Then she smiled. "I wouldn't be here without your husband." That sentence would become familiar. Everywhere Margaret went, people had stories. A retired teacher, a mechanic, a widow, a former addict. Each carried a piece of a puzzle she never knew existed. Yet none of them seemed to know the whole story. Only fragments, small acts, quiet interventions, moments of kindness. The mystery deepened. Weeks later, another discovery appeared. While repairing the well cover, Margaret found a narrow stone compartment hidden beneath one of the foundation rocks. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, weathered journals written over nearly 40 decades. Not diaries, records. Each notebook documented people facing hardship, families struggling with rent, children needing school supplies, farmers facing bankruptcy, elderly residents isolated and alone. Beside each name, Daniel had written notes, not about money, about needs, about dignity, about ways to help without embarrassing anyone. Margaret sat beside the well reading until sunset. Tears blurred the pages. All those years she thought she knew her husband, yet entire chapters of his life had remained invisible. One entry haunted her, a single sentence. "Help should feel like a hand, not a spotlight." The notebooks revealed something else. The well itself had been central to everything. People met there. Letters were exchanged there. Requests were left there. Help quietly began there. For decades, the abandoned well had served as an unofficial lifeline for the community. Nobody owned it. Everybody trusted it. And somehow, Daniel had become its caretaker. The more Margaret learned, the more impossible it seemed. Then the threat arrived. A development company purchased neighboring land. Their plans included warehouses and industrial storage facilities. The old well sat directly in the proposed expansion zone. County officials declared it unsafe, potentially hazardous. Demolition was recommended. Margaret attended the hearing alone. Experts presented reports. Engineers showed maps. Nobody argued emotionally. They simply insisted the well no longer served a purpose. Margaret looked around the room. Maybe they were right. Maybe history wasn't enough. Maybe memories couldn't save anything. The vote was scheduled for 30 days later. She drove home feeling defeated. That night, she sat beside the well. Wind moved through the grass. Darkness settled over the land. For the first time, she considered walking away. Then she heard a vehicle approaching. A truck stopped near the fence. A man stepped out. Then another vehicle arrived. And another. And another. By midnight, nearly 20 people stood around the well. Nobody had been invited. Nobody had been called. Word had simply spread. The next evening, there were 40 people. Then 60. Then 100. Stories filled the air. One woman revealed how Daniel secretly delivered groceries during a brutal winter. A farmer described receiving anonymous equipment repairs. A nurse explained how Daniel paid for a patient's medication through a chain of donations designed to protect the recipient's pride. Each story uncovered another, like ripples spreading across decades. Margaret listened in stunned silence. The man she mourned had been hiding in plain sight. Not because he wanted credit, because he didn't. The final county hearing arrived. Margaret expected a handful of supporters. Instead, the parking lot overflowed. Residents packed every seat. Some traveled hundreds of miles. Many hadn't seen one another in years. One by one, they stood. Not to protest, to testify. They spoke about kindness, about dignity, about invisible help given during invisible struggles. Nobody exaggerated. Nobody delivered dramatic speeches. They simply told the truth. The room grew quiet. Even the developers listened.
For the first time, officials realized the well wasn't a structure. It was a symbol, a physical reminder of how a community survived difficult years. The demolition order was postponed, then withdrawn. The well would remain. Margaret should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt unsettled. One mystery still remained. Why had Daniel left the property specifically to her? Days later, she found the answer. While cleaning the deepest section of the well, she discovered a sealed metal tube lodged between stones. Inside was a single envelope. Her name was written across the front. Margaret. No date, no explanation. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was short, far shorter than she expected. It read, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone. The well was never important. The people were. I know you'll spend time trying to understand what happened here. The truth is simpler than it looks. Every town has people carrying burdens nobody can see. Most don't need rescuing. They need remembering. I wasn't helping people because I had answers. I was helping because someone once did the same for me. If this place still exists, it means kindness survived longer than I did. That's enough. Take care of whoever arrives next. You don't need to change the world. Just make sure fewer people feel alone inside it." Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she cried harder than she had at Daniel's funeral. Because for the first time, she understood. His legacy wasn't the well. It wasn't the land. It wasn't the notebooks or letters. It was the chain. One person helping another, then another, then another. A chain so quiet nobody noticed until they looked back. The following spring, Margaret made a decision. She stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because she finally knew where she belonged. The old property became a gathering place again. People shared resources, mentored young families, connected job seekers with employers, delivered meals to shut-ins, left notes for neighbors in need. Nothing carried Daniel's name. That was exactly how he would have wanted it. Years later, visitors would often ask Margaret why she spent so much time at an old dry well. She always smiled before answering, "Because it's not dry." They would look confused. There was no water, no bucket, no rope, nothing. But Margaret knew better. The well had been full all along, filled with stories, filled with compassion, filled with the quiet evidence of a life that mattered. And whenever the evening sun settled over the fields, she would sit beside the stones and watch people come and go. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming friends, lonely people finding connection. The same invisible work continuing generation after generation. And sometimes, as the light faded and the wind moved gently through the grass, Margaret would imagine future visitors standing there decades later, wondering who had kept everything together, wondering who cared enough to stay, wondering whose kindness still echoed after they were gone. Because in the end, the greatest lives are rarely the loudest. They're the ones hidden beneath ordinary days. The ones measured not by what they accumulated, but by who felt less alone because they existed. And perhaps that's why people still stop at the well. Not to remember Daniel, not even to remember Margaret, but to remember what matters. That somewhere, somehow, every act of kindness leaves a mark. And long after we're gone, the people we helped may become the story that keeps someone else going.